I'm very pleased to welcome you to the first webinar of a series on transparency in budgeting, public financial management, and the Sustainable Development Goals. This is an effort of the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency to link strongly the efforts of more transparent, accountable, and inclusive budget systems with SDGs. And I am very pleased to start the series with good friends, colleagues that really honored the series with their presence and their knowledge. David Leblanc and Aranzazu Guillan from the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And they're going to be talking about this very important document that everyone should read about Sustainable Development Goals and the institutions, and particularly the group of institutions around budgeting. As you know, in order to deliver SDGs, we need strong, effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions. And how important it is to prepare, to frame budgeting towards the goals. We have seen that countries have that goal in mind, but still, although there is some action, we feel that there is not enough actions and measures and plans towards framing the budget systems towards SDGs. So during this first webinar of the series, we will talk about SDG 16, the role of institutions, particularly the institutions around budgeting, and we will have great presenters, David Leblanc and Aranzazu Guillan. The second series will look at particular experiences in the field of budgeting and SDGs. The third webinar will look at civil society, academia, and their involvement and why it is important to take them into account and include them in the efforts of institutions and SDGs. And finally, our fourth webinar will look at innovations of using budget analysis to inform budget decision-making for SDGs. The series starts today, the first day of August, and we will have every Thursday one webinar. So August is going to be quite busy for us regarding the knowledge, the experience to be shared around SDGs and institutions, and particularly budgeting. Let me now pass the microphone to, again, my dear colleagues from the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, David Leblanc and Aranzazu Guillan. Welcome, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. I mean, it's really a privilege and an honor for us to be here to launch this series of webinar with you. And, you know, GIFT has really been a key contributor to this year's report. So I would like to acknowledge that before we begin. So the World Public Sector Report 2019. So the Division for Public Institutions and Digital Government has been publishing the World Public Sector Report since 2001. So it's a repeat report, which has been with us for a long time. And the goal is really to help UN member states and illustrate how the knowledge that exists on institutions, both at the national level and at the sectoral level, can be mobilized to inform them and help them in their public administration reforms. And of course, since the adoption of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs, the effort has really been to try to link more closely traditional public administration work on accountability, transparency, efficiency, effectiveness, etc., with the SDGs in order to really make a link between the two literatures or the two traditions, one that has focused on development and sustainable development, and the other one on public administration. So this year's report, like the one from last year, is considered a science policy interface tool. And what do I mean by this? Is that it's not contrary to many reports produced by international organizations. It's not prescriptive, it's not normative either, and it's not advocacy oriented. It really aims to be descriptive and to try to provide synthesis on specific aspects of public administration in the context of the 2030 agenda. So the lens adopted by the report is really that of public administration and public institutions. And as I said, we really try to make the link between different strands of literature, I mean, from economics to social science to public administration, and to reflect a multiplicity of perspectives. For example, for this year's report, we had contributions from many international organizations and more than 80 individual experts. A specific goal of this year's report was to establish a baseline for monitoring institutional aspects of SDG 16. As you know, the system of follow-up and review of the 2030 agenda is based on a 4-year period, which is the cycle of the high-level political forum on sustainable development. And each year, the forum has been reviewing a cluster of goals. And SDG 16 was reviewed only this year, after 4 years of waiting. So there were a lot of expectations that built up on the review of this goal at the high-level political forum. Within SDG 16, so you all know SDG 16, Juan Pablo, you referred to it. I mean, it's a goal that combines different aspects, different dimensions, human rights, peace and justice, and effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions. So over the past years and months, there has been a lot of focus on human rights, access to justice, and on peace and security issues. We think that there has been much less attention on institutions, and that's what the report really wanted to talk about. So within the 12 targets of SDG 16, we chose to focus on 5 of them. Target 16.5, which focus on corruption. Target 16.6, which is about developing effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels. Target 16.7, which is about ensuring responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making. A part of Target 16.10, the part that concerns ensuring public access to information, because it's closely related to transparency, of course. And then Target 16.B, which is on non-discrimination. So these targets taken together produce a set of institutional principles, which is really what the report focuses on. The conceptual framework of the report is the following. On the right, in green, you have the institutional principles that are highlighted in SDG 16, which I just mentioned: effectiveness, transparency, access to information, accountability, etc. Those principles by themselves are not sufficient to build institutions that work well for society. We all know counterexamples, and in order to build institutions that work, these principles have to, of course, inform the building of institutions, but they also have to be informed by societal goals and strategies as expressed in national sustainable development strategies, for example, and covering different sectors, those, for example, that are covered in the goals 1 to 15 in the SDGs, poverty, health, education, etc. But the 2030 agenda also includes other principles, general principles, that should, of course, inform the development and the building of institutions, such as leaving no one behind, concern for future generations, equality, balance between the 3 dimensions of sustainable development, good governance, rule of law, and others. And finally, at the bottom, some cross-cutting tools and instruments like information systems, data systems, planning, budgeting, e-government, risk management, etc., should be seen both as tools in support of effective institutions, but The institutional principles of SDG 16 can also be seen as a lens to analyze how well these tools are performing. And as you will see shortly, the report this year does this for budgeting and for risk management in public administration. The whole report is built around this triangle between the SDGs, the institutional principles, and the tools and instruments that can support both, and around their interaction. The first chapter of the report is an attempt at stock taking of trends and status of knowledge on the effectiveness of institutional arrangements for the SDGs. The second chapter looks at one of the institutional principles, and specifically integrity and anti-corruption, and tries to make the link between institutional approach and tool in various SDG areas. The third chapter is about budget and planning processes, as mentioned by Juan Pablo. And this is, I would say, an exception in the sense that the community working on budget and planning is and has been using for a long time the institutional principles to structure their own work. So when we talk about accountability, transparency, it makes sense to people working on budgeting and on processes, but it might not make sense to people working on agriculture and gender, etc. So one challenge for the report has been to make the link more explicit, even when people, experts in the field, are not used to using those principles. The fourth chapter is about risk management in public administration, and we also look at it from the point of view of the institutional principles, but we also try to link it to SDGs. And finally, the fifth chapter look at a specific SDG, SDG 5 on gender equality, and looks at institutions that promote gender equality through the prism of the institutional principles. In the remaining of this presentation, we want to give you very quick highlights on three chapters. The first on chapter 1, because it's what we found regarding the progress on institutional aspects of SDG 16. Next will be the budget chapter, which is the main, the pièce de résistance for this webinar. And then we were also asked to provide some insight on chapter 4 on risk management. Regarding chapter 1, one difficulty that we faced when we tried to establish a sort of baseline for the targets of SDG 16 is that principles such as transparency, accountability, participation are in fact very broad, encompass many different functions or forms. One consequence of that is that it's very hard to come up with universal definitions of progress. The country context matters enormously. For example, if you think in terms of transparency, what is the appropriate balance of transparency in a given country? This will depend on a lot of factors, including cultural, social norms, including the rest of the institutional systems, and you don't have simple indicators or simple ways to measure progress. Then another challenge is that this field is in fact a collection of disparate and heterogeneous fields of study. The different aspects, the different dimensions are studied by different communities, sometimes different people working in developed countries, developing countries, and they don't always, you feel that they don't always talk to one another or even are aware of what's happening in other fields. And so the way we try to address this is to break down the principles, for example, transparency, into smaller pieces on which we can see trends and look for assessments of effectiveness. Generally speaking, we found across the board that much more information is available on processes, inputs, and to lesser degree on outputs than on outcomes and broader impacts. But of course, that's the latter as what is more important. For example, in terms of access to information, there is a lot of information on the number of countries that adopted access to information laws, on the cases that were submitted, how cases are processed, etc., etc. But what about the outcomes of that, the broader impacts? I mean, this is something that's currently very patchy. And the same goes for another principle, for example, like non-discrimination. It's very easy to see which countries has adopted which law or has ratified which convention, But in terms of outcomes, impacts, and broader effects on society, it becomes much scarcer in terms of information. So there are large gaps in our knowledge of the effectiveness of institutional arrangements. And when there is knowledge, generally there is also large variation in the effectiveness of initiatives across different countries. One fundamental difficulty is that the principles, accountability, transparency, etc., interact among themselves. For example, increased transparency by itself may not lead to less corruption. Access to information by itself may not lead to greater accountability. But when combined with participation and empowerment, in some circumstances, it can, in fact, lead to greater accountability. So whenever we look at the effectiveness of institutional arrangement, there's a need to look at the whole institutional system or whole institutional ecosystem, because otherwise one cannot generalize. Let me give the floor to Arantxa now for Chapter 3.
Thank you, David. As David just mentioned, Chapter 3 focuses on budget processes in support of SDG implementation. And the chapter is the result of the valuable contributions of many individual experts and institutions, and we would like to thank GIFT, both Lorena and Juan Pablo, for the inputs and the contributions to this chapter. The chapter really begins with a simple but critical premise that budgets should allow governments to measure shifts in the allocation of public resources across the various sustainable development goals, and to determine how the allocation of resources contributes to realizing sustainable development objectives in the short, medium, and long term. Based on this premise, the chapter takes stock of ongoing efforts to link national budget processes with the SDGs, what we often know as SDG budgeting. And second, examines how the institutional principles of SDG 16 relate to the various stages of the budget process, the tools used to implement these principles, and the available evidence of their effectiveness. Regarding SDG budgeting, and just to provide a snapshot, since this will be the focus of the second webinar in this series, the chapter really emphasizes how the budget process can be a powerful instrument to promote the integrated approaches that characterize the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. However, we still see limited efforts to adapt and to link national budget systems with the SDGs, and most of these efforts are SDG specific and ad hoc. For example, there are many efforts related to climate finance. Last year, in 2018, there were several efforts by different organizations to understand and map some of the initiatives to adapt the national budget systems with the SDGs. These initiatives do not really cover all regions and countries, and they use different criteria, but I think there is a common conclusion, a common takeaway from these studies is that they really show limited adaptation of national budget systems to the SDGs, except for a small number of countries. And we have, of course, the example of Mexico, which is described in detail in the report, other countries in Latin America, like Colombia and Uruguay, and other regions as well, like Latvia and Vietnam. So really, one of the critical messages of the report is that all countries cannot be expected to adopt the most ambitious versions of SDG budgeting in the medium term, and even perhaps by 2030, because there are different contexts, different political, administrative, and technical constraints. But there are different options, and these should be selected according to the national circumstances. And the chapter really presents and elaborates on some of the options that are available for countries. Another critical message of the chapter is that ongoing PFM reforms, which are often unrelated to the SDGs, can really provide good opportunities, good entry points to adapt the budget process and to link budget systems with the SDGs. One possible key driver is, of course, the role of international organizations and international financing institutions, but there are also different tools available for countries. There are diagnostic tools available, for example, the UNDP's Budget Integration Index, tools that allow countries to assess what are the gaps in the PFM systems, where the SDGs are not really integrated into the budget process. As we mentioned, each chapter looks at all the institutional principles that David presented at the beginning, but we would like to highlight one principle regarding the budget chapter, which is the principle of accountability, to the extent that sound budget accountability really builds on better transparency and better participation in the budget process. So the chapter really presents different initiatives that have been used in the last years for advancing accountability throughout the budget cycle, throughout the budget process, including the role of independent fiscal institutions, providing multi-year information on fiscal policy and objectives, enhancing participatory budgeting, strengthening audit systems, etc. In the SDG context, there are three elements that the chapter highlights as particularly critical. One is that budget accountability should be for the full government commitments, not only direct spending, but also tax expenditures. And this requires improving the transparency of tax expenditures and subjecting them also to the performance test of having specific goals, measures, and periodic reporting. A second critical element also is the importance of combining financial and performance information in budget documents. This is critical to be able to link expenditures and performance and results. And also it's important to use performance information not only during the budget execution stage, but also to inform policy and budget formulation. And a third element that is important is to enhance the evidence base of budget decisions. To the extent that public institutions incorporate performance information, they can improve the effectiveness in the implementation of their programs, but also encourage and stimulate innovation based on the results of evaluations and performance assessment. The chapter presents some of the recent reforms to strengthen accountability in the budget process, including strengthening the role of parliaments, the capacity of independent oversight institutions, and different initiatives also for creating opportunities for more citizen engagement in budget processes. Having a strong PFM system at the national level is correlated with lower levels of corruption, and there are recent evidence that indicates that in many cases PFM institutions can be more critical in terms of addressing corruption risk than specialized anti-corruption agencies. Of course, there are many challenges to understand and address corruption in the budget process. There is no standard methodology to measure corruption in relation to the budget. However, the chapter provides information on different corruption risks that can be easily identified in the budget process and some of the initiatives to address these risks. Of course, these risks vary across the different stages of the budget process and have to do with interrelations between the different actors involved. And we know that these relations are in part technical, but there are also many political considerations involved. In general, the evidence of effectiveness about PFM reforms is strong in the sense that we have evidence that indicate that PFM reforms can be effective in addressing corruption risks in public administration and the budget process. However, the specific evidence for a specific type of reforms is not so solid. We present some of the evidence in terms of public procurement reforms, public expenditure tracking, central budget planning and management, some of the tools at the budget execution stage that allow to streamline processes, strengthen controls. But I think one of the critical messages of the report also is that while PFM reforms can be quite effective to address some of these risks that we see in the figure in the different stages of the budget process, we cannot have too high expectations either. PFM reforms are part of the solution, but by themselves, they are not the panacea to address all budget corruption problems. And finally, I would like to say a few words about the principle of no discrimination and how in the budget process, one of the elements, one of the tools through which this principle is analyzed is through gender responsive budgeting. There have been a lot of interest in the last years, increasing international attention on gender responsive budgeting related to discussions regarding financing from gender equality, the discussions on the 2030 agenda. One of the indicators in the SDGs, indicator 5.C.1, actually refers to the proportion of countries with systems to track and make public allocations for gender equality and women's empowerment. There are different categories of gender-responsive budgeting systems: gender-informed resource allocation, gender-assessed budgets, gender budgeting based on needs assessment. Independently of the approach that is used, in the last year, there have been an increasing number of tools that can be used at the different stages of the budget cycle, and that is reflected in the figure that you have there, in order to strengthen the responsiveness of the budget to gender issues and gender equality issues. So we have a variety of tools. Some of these tools have been also used and applied in the last years to other disadvantaged groups like children, persons with disabilities, and ethnic minorities. There are three challenges that the chapter identifies for gender responsive budgeting. One is that when the objective of the gender responsive budgeting system or tool is only to track the resource allocation, it may actually not lead to an increase resources or to provide insights into the impact and the outcomes for women or other groups, especially when the allocations are in practice not spent. A second challenge has to do with the scope of gender responsive budgeting. There is a tendency to focus only on spending, and the chapter indicates how it's important to look also at the taxes, the revenues, and extra budgetary resources, which are increasingly important in all countries. And finally, there is a challenge in terms of data availability, not only to track gender-related allocations, but also to assess the impact on gender issues, women, and other groups. The evidence of effectiveness is mixed, due in many cases to the recent adoption of these tools in many countries. However, it indicates that contextual enabling factors are very important, and also being able to identify specific objectives, why these tools are introduced into the budget process and for what.
So let me now briefly say a few words on Chapter 4, which focuses on risk management in public administration in the context of the SDGs. So public administration has a critical role to play in managing risk as risk manager first, then as regulator in almost all cases, and or in other roles, for example, as insurer of last resort. And there is an extreme variety of risk, of course. In fact, it would be hard to identify any SDG area where you can't think of at least 3 or 4 different categories of risk that are sufficiently important for the government to actively take a role in managing them. The development of risk management practices have been largely independent from one sector to another. I mean, in some sector, if you think of the financial sector, for example, I mean, it's been decades or even centuries since there was a realization that the government had a critical role to manage and mitigate risks. In the environment, I mean, the involvement of government has been ramping up over the past, let's say, 50 years or so. In other sectors, the risk culture is still less developed. And as a whole, risk management at the national level is still primarily done on a sectoral basis, which is fine, and as you know, there are many good reasons for that. But yet, as is increasingly clear, risks across sectors and SDG areas intersect frequently, and they impact one another. So in this context, one of the key questions is that, that of the causal linkages, the synergies, on the trade-offs among risks. For example, do some of the risks across different sectors in the Sustainable Development Agenda warrant joint management by public administration? And in such case, are the current government structures, institutions, and capacity adequate for the delivery of multi-sectoral risk management? What we saw while doing the review for the chapter is that there is an emerging trend towards more holistic management of risk. There is increased trends of integration of risk management across sectors, across levels of government. There are more and more countries that prepare comprehensive national risk assessments that try to map different kinds of risk. Very few countries have created a position of chief risk officer or equivalent with a role of coordinating government response across a broad range of risk. And what one finds too is the critical importance of political leadership and its impact on the performance of public administration in managing risk. The SDGs, because they are so broad and cover practically all areas of human activity, provide a very conducive framework for advancing integrated risk management, more holistic ways of managing risk, both at the political level and administrative level. If you look at the targets of the SDGs, Many of them explicitly refers to risk, to vulnerability, to shocks, to disasters, to early warning system. And this is a massive change compared to, for example, to the Millennium Development Goals. So the notion of risk is really embedded into the formulation of the agenda itself. And this really provides an opportunity. As I was mentioning, and we had the example of budgets just before this, the institutional principles of SDG 16 provide a very interesting lens to look at risk management as well. And just to give two examples, in terms of transparency, for example, there are connections between transparency and risk management. Transparency on risk, on the likelihood of risk and potential impacts is critical, of course, for managing risk correctly. In many sectors, mandatory disclosure has been one of the ways that risk has been mitigated with mixed effectiveness, but it's widely used. Communication around risk is getting more and more importance in the discourse on risk management, and it's of course a component of transparency policy. If I go to accountability, it's also accountability about who takes on the risk and who takes on the consequences and how the consequences are managed is really one of the cornerstones of effective risk management. The sharing of risk between different partners in institutional arrangements, public-private partnerships is just one of them, is also critical for effective management, and so on and so forth. So, for every single one of these principles, looking at risk management from that particular angle gives you some criteria to assess the performance of risk management in public administration. So in terms of broad conclusions for the report, one of the conclusions is that these institutional principles that SDG 16 highlights are going to be very effective and a very good lens to analyze the performance of institutions at the sector level and at the process level. And this is something that is really helps in making the connection between the substantive part of the Sustainable Development Agenda and the institutional part. Yet measuring the performance of institutions, while highly needed, remains very elusive. And we think that there should be more efforts, for example, from academia or from think tanks or international organizations to really try to measure more outcomes and impacts. GIFT has started doing this in the area of budgeting, but this is needed across the board. And finally, progress on institutional aspects of the SDGs can only be meaningfully defined in reference to a specific country context. At the national level, there are many existing processes that measure bits and pieces of SDG 16. For example, institutional reform, reform of the justice system, but even reporting to international treaties. And finding ways to assemble this in a coherent picture would probably provide a good way forward for countries to better measure institutional performance in the context of the agenda. And once again, SDG 16 can serve as a useful umbrella because it covers so many aspects to think of national institutions for the SDGs in a holistic way. And that's the end of the presentation.
Magnifico. This is a very ambitious and complete piece of work. You've presented it in 25 minutes, which is a great achievement. But the main message is that if you are into your country working for obtaining and for achieving the SDGs, this is a reading that you cannot miss. I very much like how rich it is on very specific examples and how it illustrates with those examples very specific responses to some of the questions that people ask regarding what institutions to involve, how to involve them, and how to measure progress. Something that I like very much about the report is that it stresses out that in this endeavor, governments cannot do it on their own. They basically need a very strong engagement of civil society, participation, academia, as you mentioned, and in that other check and balance institutions such as the Supreme Audit Institutions. We had a very important seminar on it a couple of weeks ago. And in all of this, transparency is a key word for reaching SDGs. So thank you again. We have a couple of questions. One of them regards chapter 3 on budgeting. And the question is, what makes a good practice? Aranza, you refer to a couple of examples. Why are these countries exemplary? I know that you could devote a lot of time to each of them, but if you could point out at what makes them relevant or outstanding, at least at the moment, that's one. And another question that we have here on the screen for you is regarding Chapter 2. David mentioned that there is more information about processes and outputs, but not about outcomes or impact. Is there a plan by you guys at the UN to conduct a cross-sectional study to assess the impact of implementing the principles, or it will only be assessed through the indicators network? Let's start with those two questions, if you please.
In terms of the question for Chapter 3 on what makes this a good practice, I think, I mean, we somehow refrain of talking about good practices in general in the World Public Sector reports. It's more about providing examples of what's happening and what member states are doing. In terms of SDG budgeting, I would say that using the expression, but almost every example that we have of SDG budgeting constitutes somehow a good practice, because there are not so many. We really have very few examples of countries that have been working in the last years in terms of aligning and adapting the budget systems to the SDGs. Most of the efforts in these initial years have been on institutional coordination mechanisms rather than looking at the budget. So there are a few examples that are moving in this direction. Of course, the case of Mexico that Lorena knows much better than I do and is reflected in the example, I think is very significant, because it's probably the country that has moved the farthest in terms of adapting and aligning the budget system to the SDGs, in terms of having a methodology to really integrate the SDGs, the different targets into the budget system and the budget documents. And also, I think one of the key elements that, or why the different cases are really represent different approaches, is that it also has to do with the budget processes and the budget system in each country, and how each country is moving more in the direction of having a more performance-based budgeting or not. But of course, there are different things that you can do no matter where you are in that process. But of course, the link that you will make to the SDGs will be different. And I think what we have tried to do in the chapter is really to illustrate some of those options that you can take depending on where you are in that process. And then, of course, highlight a few cases in which, because they have done a kind of more systematic work, or they illustrate the different approaches can be significant for countries to learn from.
And just to add on this, I mean, in the context of SDG budgeting, I think, you know, one of the key messages of the chapter is really that, as Aranza said, we should refrain from a kind of advocacy discourse that would say, okay, you just need to, you know, be willing to do it and then it will happen. I mean, there are broader, I mean, besides technical factors, there are broader political factors that so far have really limited the linking of budgeting and budgeting systems and the SDGs. For example, if you look at OECD countries, supposedly those don't have technical difficulties to make linkages between, you know, their performance systems, the budget and planning processes. But the OECD found that, you know, the linkages, for example, the inclusion of performance indicators related to SDGs in budget processes were really few and far between. And one of the examples that Italy chose to present to the rest of the world at the UN this year was that they would now include a few indicators on social welfare in you know, the documents that goes to Parliament on the budget. So that's the level we are talking about. And you know, Mexico is really an outlier in some sense, because they really worked from the beginning on the linkages between the planning and the budget process. But you know, political priority in terms of how, you know, high the SDGs are on the agenda is also a very, to me, a determining factor in that.
Thank you. Yeah, the second question, please.
The second questions, I mean, in terms of what the UN can do, I mean, we all know that at the global level, I mean, the mandate of the UN, one clear mandate has been to review progress based on the set of intergovernmentally determined global indicators. But we also all know, and if you look at chapter 1, there is a discussion on this, that just for SDG 16, when you look at global indicators, they have almost no policy relevant content. I mean, there is no indicator whatsoever on transparency, for example, or maybe one. There is one on accountability, which is budget credibility. On corruption, there is, you know, the indicators are about the proportion of people or businesses that take briberies or offer briberies. But so any of these indicators, when you delve into corruption, for example, will not provide you with you know, concrete leads or options for administrative reform. So you obviously need to go much deeper into looking at what's happening to whole institutional systems within a specific country context to make things happen. And that's why what we've tried to do with this report, to really look more from the practical side and not, you know, focus overwhelmingly on indicators, because that's a line of work. That's you know, that's a mandate that was part of the agenda. But of course, it should not be only about this. And you know, the only way you can help countries, I think, is really focus from the bottom up on what's happening at the country level, and from a process systems perspective, not from an indicator perspective so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, David, Aranza. There is another question on communities, local governments. We very much focus on budgeting at the national level, but then how to bring along where people live?
Well, the chapter on budget focuses on the national level, although it recognizes that many of the most innovative initiatives to strengthen some of the institutional principles in budget processes take place at the subnational and local level, and also are at those levels in many cases that we have more evidence of effectiveness. And of course, participatory budgeting is one of the examples, where many of the initiatives, or most of the initiatives, take place at the local level, at the municipal level, the city level, and also where most of the evidence, the empirical evidence that we have in terms of the positive impact and the positive effect of these initiatives is also still at the local level. So we recognize this, although the chapter has not gone in detail into exploring the subnational and the local level. But of course, in the context of the SDGs, there is a very active role of the subnational and the local level, even in countries in which the 2030 agenda is not a priority at the national level. We see a lot of initiatives taking place at the subnational, local, and city level, and also a lot of initiatives in terms of how to best coordinate efforts taking place at different levels of government. And I think this is also critical in terms of the budget processes, especially in countries which have decentralized institutional structures, federal systems, where also transfers of resources between different levels are key. So I think also as a kind of a gap in the report, but also kind of a to-do for next research, is looking more into detail on the subnational and the local level.
Thank you. We're about to come to the ending of our first webinar. But before we conclude, I would like to know what is next for UNDESA, the UN Department for Economic and Social Affairs, regarding this very important topic. How can you help countries speak to each other, learn from each other? This is one effort, but we are not there yet, and I would like to know more about how to keep this very interesting dialogue and collaboration with you.
A few elements of answer on this. I mean, the choice of topic, I mean, let me start with the analytical products, I mean, the World Public Sector Report. The choice of the topics for last year's report, which was on integration, policy integration, and for this year was in some, at least in some part, dictated by the agenda, the intergovernmental agenda at the UN, which is the high-level political forum on sustainable development. And one thing that matters in this regard is the organization of the review and follow-up process of the SDGs for the next cycle of the HLPF, which is after 2019. And this has not been decided yet. So next year, countries are going to review the review process for the agenda and decide on how they want to conduct reviews for the next cycle of the 2030 agenda. And they might or might not keep this system of looking only at the clusters of SDGs every year. And that would, the decision they make in terms of this follow-up and review process would inform the choice of topics that we would select because, we don't have such resources that we can work on multiple fronts every year. So that's for the topic of the next World Public Sector reports. I think much as important, perhaps even more important, is the collaboration that we have with groups and institutions like yours, Juan Pablo, with GIFT, with the International Budget Partnerships, and with others. And I think, during the past few years and months, we have started a dialogue, which we intend to continue by all means. And I think, as we delve deeper in these topics, we can look at specific aspects. I think the important point for us is that what we look at should be of interest to the communities of practice working on budget, for example, or on other topics, and that's why we will be seeking continued collaboration with GIFT and with others. A third thing that we will continue doing is try to take advantage of the convening role of the UN. I mean, as you mentioned, for the past 3 years we have had larger and larger meetings of supreme audit institutions around the auditing of SDGs, and this is really a way for us to use the fact that everybody is willing to consider coming to the UN headquarters for a few days to mobilize communities of practices and also foster exchange and dialogue between them and other international or national organizations.
Great. Any concluding words from you, Aranza?
Well, as David said, for us it's always interesting to hear from participants in this webinar and other activities in terms of what are their interests, in terms of and needs, in terms of research and support to try to, within our mandate and the scope of our activities, address those. And it's always a good opportunity also to touch base with what is happening in countries and different institutions. So we really welcome this opportunity. And of course, we will look forward to continue working with GIFT and IBP and others around these topics. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we will be pleased for that and for a continuing collaboration. Let me thank you again very much for your time, for sharing the knowledge and the wonderful work that you put together in these series reports. Congratulations again. We will have this exchange and your presentations online so people can come back to it, and hopefully this will help us continue a very productive collaboration and conversation about ways to address SDGs and how to prepare institutions towards achieving the goals. Thank you again. Let me invite our participants. Some of them had some more questions. One of them on participation in the budget process. And on that, we will have very specific examples 1 week from today in our second webinar. Don't miss that webinar and don't miss the series. Thank you again for your participation. Have a great day.